The topic of today's video is stabilizers. Now, we all know that there's a reason why stabilizers are used in archery in general. The extra mass is harder to pull off target, it slows down the dancing of your pin, and moving weight out away from your bow can make your bow rotationally more stable. Those things are tough to argue, but for bow hunting, do they actually make enough difference to be worth it? Rather than just give you my opinion, I've done quite a bit of testing with this setup to try and quantify how much of a difference a moderately sized set of stabilizers gives to help you decide if it's worth it or not for your particular setup, as well as go through some practical implications out in the woods. First, some quick facts on stabilizers. To maximize effect, you'd ideally have bars that are very light and stiff, have minimal wind profile, so that you're able to just get the effect of that mass out away from your bow. Stabilizer stiffness depends on both material and geometry. Most bars are made out of some sort of carbon fiber, the commercially available ones anyway, which will be stiffer than aluminum of the same profile. Stiffness increases exponentially with diameter, but that also has to be balanced with the larger profile in the wind. Stabilizer flex also increases exponentially with length, so the longer the bar, the more critical stiffness becomes. Think of your stabilizer like a lever arm sticking out from the pivot point in your bow. The longer it is, the less weight that you need at the front end for a similar effect. Length needs to be balanced though with practicality in the woods. Vibration dampening might not do much for stability in a stabilizer, but it could definitely make your shooting experience better. In the past, I've hunted with everything up to the typical front and sidebar setup like you'd see here, all the way down to just using a quiver and no stabilizers, which is pretty much worst case from a stability standpoint. Though I've made my own stabilizers in the past from aluminum, and I'll have a link to that video if you're interested in checking it out, the setup that I use for this testing is the DOA model of stabilizers from Titanium Archery Products. The first thing I wanted to test was stability, and in order to do that, I used a product called the Mantis X8 that uses accelerometers to track your bow's movement on a very fine scale, and then you can use that to track and kind of monitor and coach yourself as you're shooting, but it also gives you a stability number. Imagine a score of 100 being perfect, like a shooting machine. And so the closer you get to 100, you know the more stable that particular shot was. I took a lot of shots at various different times with the setups that I was looking at, tried to mix them up so that I wasn't just biasing myself on better shooting with whatever I was shooting first, and then worse with the more I got fatigued. I tried to make sure there was a good mixture of fresh and fatigued shots for each group. I of course did a control group with zero stabilization whatsoever. I tested a setup that was sort of middle of the road for what you might see in hunting setups that do have a front and sidebar. This is a 6 3/4 inch sidebar and a 10 3/4 inch front bar. I tried a setup that was just a sidebar and no front bar at all. And I also tested this setup, which is 11 3/4 inch bar in the front with 3 ounces, 10 3/4 inch bar in the back with 11 ounces. So you can see I needed some steel fender washers to build that weight up, but this is my more extreme setup. Target archers, of course, will use longer bars and oftentimes even more weight than that. And quiver on versus quiver off is probably a discussion for a different time, but that's something you're going to want to keep in mind also and stay consistent when you're doing this type of testing. Do all of your tuning, all of your testing with a quiver on if that's what you're going to hunt with. I've more frequently been taking my quiver off once I get up into the tree, so I left my quiver off for a lot of this testing. And one thing I just want to note about these setups, before I started taking any data on any of these, I went through and made sure that they were all balanced so that my bubble level when I come to full draw and sit naturally would be sitting just perfectly level when I'd open my eyes. And I would also adjust the front versus the back weight in such a way that that pin just wanted to kind of float in the middle of the target. It wouldn't want to kind of tip up out of the target and wouldn't want to drop down and dip low out of the target. So once I had that balance right for whatever the particular scenario was, that's when I would start the data collection. All right, so I have my data here from the Mantis X8 testing. This chart right here shows all of the data for basically all of the shots grouped together. The good shots, the bad shots, the fatigued shots versus the fresh shots, everything is in there. When we look at the unstabilized group, you'll see that I had a couple good shots in there, couple good, stable, high scores. But the average and kind of the median of those data points was down kind of like the 93 range, and there's a couple of low outliers in the 87, 88 range, which I didn't see in basically any of the other setups. If you look at the best group from a variability standpoint, it was actually the group where I didn't have a front bar. Just that rear bar all by itself had the tightest cluster of data points. It was very consistent in terms of the stability scores. And when you look at this golden group, it actually had the highest cluster of really good shots. I had a couple shots that were right at kind of that high 96, 97 range, which were the highest points out of that entire data set. But what you do notice though is that it had a little bit more variability too, where I had some shots that were kind of poor in like the 93, 94 range. And what's interesting, if you break that out even further, we'll move to this chart, which it's just kind of the fresh shots versus the fatigued shots. And I think this graph is really telling too, because what it tells me is that that green group, which is the unstabilized shots shot and captured during the most fatigued time of my shooting, definitely had a worse cluster of data points than anything else. And the best looking set of data points on here is this dark blue, which is the extreme, the most weight, the longest bars, when I was shooting it fresh. And when I was shooting that same setup when I was more fatigued, then the variation opened up a little bit more and that average value shifted down. And what that kind of says to me is that perhaps that total amount of overall weight with that setup, despite the fact that it was very stable right away, maybe that was a little bit too much for me to handle. And by the time I got to those more fatigued shots, it was a little bit of a struggle for me to continue shooting that amount of overall mass weight of the bow. Perhaps if I was target shooting, where you're only shooting 1 or 2 shots at a time, that might work out a little bit better. And that's probably why you see guys shooting sometimes very heavy setups. And with just the sidebar all by itself, there's really, those data sets look almost identical. So that kind of said to me, okay, maybe whatever I tested there, not only was a good balance for me, but it was also maybe a good overall mass weight to where I could shoot it pretty well fatigued, as well as shoot it pretty good when I was fresh. But of course, these are just numbers on paper. What is that going to translate to into actual groups on target? And so that's what we're going to talk about next. I've done quite a bit of testing at the range at longer distances. I had tested over several days, both in calm weather and in wind. And each time I shot a configuration on a given day, I put 12 shots into a fresh target face. This is because 12 seemed to be a number that gave a good representation of the good, great, and mediocre shots. Sometimes I'd string together 3 really great shots, even with the unstabilized setup. But it wasn't really representative of something I could do every time, or representative of how good I shot on average with the setup. Shooting more shots allowed me to calculate a mean radius per group, which is much more useful information to have than a best 3-shot group. Okay, so I've got all these target sheets from all the various shooting sessions that I've done with these stabilizers, and just kind of wanted to explain what you're looking at when I'll show these numbers. So the measurements that I'm taking are total group size and also mean radius. Mean radius just means if you were to find the mathematical center of all of these and then measure each one of these individual shots and their distance from that center point and then average them out. And why that's nice is because you could have a group that has a really tight cluster of shots, but then maybe a couple outliers that make the group overall bigger. But then you could have a group like this where it's all just kind of evenly spread throughout, and they might have the same group size, but the group that had the tighter cluster in the center with a couple outliers is going to have a much better mean radius number. And so looking at the computer here, I've plotted everything out over 4 different days of shooting, different wind conditions, and it's color coded, so that hopefully makes it a little bit easier to see, green is good, red is bad. But on this first group here, which is the 4 targets I showed you here, you could tell that most of the groups were pretty close when you actually analyze them, although the unstabilized group was a fair bit worse. Number 1, the unstabilized overall group size is 62% larger than what the best one was, which in this case was the no front bar, surprisingly enough, and just that sidebar. You can also say that the average unstabilized shot is 64% further from the center than the best. And in that case, it would have been the 11-inch front bar with 2 ounces, 7-inch rear bar with the 6 ounces. And that's just based off of that mean radius. And then we drop down to day 3 here. This one was a little bit harder shooting conditions. It was windier, but there was also a lot of trees. And so you get these blustery conditions that were just really hard to predict. It made it hard to hold steady. Overall, you see the group sizes here are a little bit bigger. But what you see is that once again, the 3 stabilized groups are pretty close to one another. And the average unstabilized shot was 36% further from center than the best. And again, when I say furthest from center, it's not the furthest from center of the target because they had slightly different point of impacts. It's furthest from center of its own mathematical center point of that group. So the takeaway for me when I look at all this information is that if I'm doing some kind of middle of the road stabilization setup where I have the bow balanced, because all these different setups, even though they had different weights and lengths, They all allowed that bow to balance pretty nicely side to side and front to back when I'm holding on target. It seems like just about any one of them made a noticeable difference over shooting without any stabilization whatsoever. And I would imagine that in order to get kind of another stepwise increase here, you might have to go to something like a target stabilizer setup. You know, if I threw on a 24-inch or 30-inch front bar and a longer back bar with even more weight, then I might see, again, you know, significantly better numbers than what I'm getting with the stabilized group shot here. That's just kind of speculation, but it would make sense. Now, for practicality up in a tree, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, and you may have even heard this argument before, is that when you have an arrow nocked, your arrow is longer than any stabilizer you're probably going to be running anyway. So from that perspective, any maneuverability concerns are going to be sort of overridden in terms of what your front bar is. And the back bar really doesn't seem to get in the way all that much. So if you take a look at this branch right in front of me here, if I was going to maneuver my bow past it, I have to make sure that both the stabilizer and the arrow were to clear it. But what if I'm already at full draw? If I draw back on a deer back here, and then I need to follow it, that stabilizer bar is going to get in the way to where I'd have to pull that whole thing around that limb to continue following that deer at full draw. So that's just something you're going to have to keep in mind, is that if you're at full draw, you still have the length of that stabilizer to contend with. Now that same consideration and awareness of the front bar at full draw needs to happen when you're ground hunting as well, whether you're tucked into a deadfall or hunting out of a ground blind. The sidebar doesn't really seem to ever get in the way too much unless you're putting the bow into a case, and that's when having a quick disconnect mount like this one really comes in handy. One practical advantage I see to the front bar is that you can drape the bow over your shoulders when walking as an extra carry option. One practical advantage of the sidebar is that you're able to tuck that sidebar into your hip and kind of lean the bow against yourself and take a lot of the weight off of your arm. There are a few things that I really learned the importance of during this testing. One is proper form. Stabilizers aren't going to fix bad form. They may even make bad form worse if you're not careful. So in a hierarchy of importance, work on good alignment and proper draw length first if those aren't already ironed out. Secondly, adjusting weights and lengths can make small changes to how your bow reacts at the shot. That can change your tune and your point of impact slightly. If you do experiment with different setups, make sure to verify that your tune is still good and correct it if it isn't. I didn't see massive changes, maybe going from say a perfect bare shaft bullet hole to a 1/4 inch tear, something that's easily correctable with a micro rest adjustment. Third, make sure to practice your uphill and downhill shots or shots from a tree to make sure that whatever you set up on level ground still translates and still balances well at that angle. If you were just going to use a single stabilizer bar, my results would suggest that you might actually be better off using just a sidebar or no front bar, rather than just using a front bar and no sidebar. Most often in the bow hunting world, we see people using shorter front bars and then wondering if it's worth it for them to add a sidebar. But the opposite might actually be a better starting point, because you can improve the way that your bow balances at full draw and make the bow's perceived weight a little bit lighter just by moving that center mass backwards a little bit. Then you could add the front bar to add some additional stability and calm down your side-to-side pin float a little bit. At the conclusion of all this testing, for me, I was really on the fence between using just a long, moderately weighted sidebar all by itself and not using a front bar, or using it in conjunction with a lightly weighted front bar. I had really good downrange results and balance with just the sidebar. Not quite as good as having both, but good enough to where I had to shoot a lot of arrows to really tell and measure a difference. But both setups were way better than no stabilizers at all. And so here's what ended up solidifying the choice for me. Matthews makes these engaged limb legs. There's something that I would use when ground hunting. And when I compared the point of impact, when I was just using only the sidebar, not a front bar, the point of impact would change slightly if I had those engaged limb legs on. It wasn't much, maybe a few inches at longer distances where I could tell the center of the group would shift, but it was still there. However, when I had the full setup with the sidebar and the front bar, the engaged limb legs didn't really seem to make a difference one way or the other. And I'd measure groups, and I really couldn't discern much of a measurable difference between the two. So that really made the difference for me. Just knowing that regardless if I was going to hunt on the ground and use the legs or hunt out of a tree and not use them, I was going to have the same point of impact. It was a big confidence boost. And so the setup that I'll hunt with is this 11 3/4 inch front bar with 2 ounces on the end and a 10 3/4 inch back bar with 6 ounces of weight on the back. Now, my results may very well be different than yours. Different shooter, different bow, so don't take my setup or anyone else's and try to just strictly replicate it. I will say this though, going through this effort has given me a ton of confidence in knowing that I've demonstrated for myself what works the best for my hunting style, and that confidence is a really powerful thing in the woods. So in summary, properly balanced stabilizers do make measurable improvements in your shooting. They help slow down your pin float and have it move more calmly, especially under stress or fatigue. They help balance your bow at full draw. But at very close range, you might be talking the difference in a group size that goes from, say, this to this. Ultimately, it's something you're going to have to figure out for yourself and make a decision based on how you hunt, how much weight you want to bring in, how rattled you get in high pressure scenarios. But it's definitely something worth experimenting with if you haven't already. I hope this video was helpful, and if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments section down below. Thanks for watching.